before we start doing the prep work on sanding the BMW E46. Like I said, I've been talking about, we're going to do some repairs on the paint, doing the hood and some of the rear quarter panels and some other spots that have some rust. We're going to be blending it in. So it's going to be kind of a mini series on what's all going on. First off, let's go to the car. We're going to start with the hood, start removing some of the things like the grills and some other shit, and we're going to start preparing it, start sanding it down. Body work takes patience, and I lack fucking patience, so this will be a good learning experience for me as well. And then we're going to tape up the sides of the fenders, because when we're sanding, we don't want to damage the paint, so I'll get some tape right now, some masking tape, and we'll mask that off. When you're prepping for paint, it's important to remove things like this, the grill, because it's all inside here. That's going to be noticeable when you end up painting it, because you're going to mask off the grill and whatever, but when you paint it, you're not going to get inside of here. And if you don't sand properly around these edges when you have that grill in, which is almost impossible, your paint's going to start peeling from there back. And then also, what I like to do is I prep for paint. Since we're sanding down the hood, I over taped on the side here. That also helps with the overspray when I'm painting, but I put the tape on the side there, so when I'm sanding, I'm not going to damage the paint on the side. I ran out of tape, so I usually put about 2 layers of tape so it's nice and thick, so if I nick it, I'm not... So now before we start sanding the hood on the car, we're going to talk about sanders, and this is probably the best sander to use. I'm not talking about the brand name, it's a Snap-on brand name, but any kind of orbital sander will work. This is an air-powered one, and it works really well. The only downfall with an air-powered sander is you need a compressor that can power it. Ooh, beer burps. Oh, yeah. Mine is a fairly large compressor. It's a 5 horsepower compressor, but even it cannot keep up to the air this uses. So I'm going to show you a different option that you can use. So another option is, this is one example, is a DeWalt orbital sander. It's a hook and loop, so like basically a Velcro pad. Has variable speeds on the side so you can control your sanding. This is also pretty expensive and it does a real good job. Now if you don't have an orbital sander and you don't have an air sander, there's still other methods. You can hand sand it with a block, wet sand the paint. Basically you just got to take the finish off of it, the smoothness, the glaze, in order for the paint to stick. So I'm going to show you how both of these work, and then you can make a decision how you want to sand your vehicle. Okay, this is going to be with the electric sander. Now we're going to use the air sander. This is 150 grit. The DeWalt electrical sander was 220, so this is obviously going to take off more than what the other one did. So here I am, I sanded down the hood, and then I took a cleaner solvent to help kind of take off some of the paint dust. But you can see all these little red dots I drew on there. Those are all stone chips that will appear once I repaint it, besides for the dents I got. So I'm gonna go with probably 100 grit sandpaper now, and we're gonna cut this down even farther. So here's the hood after I went through and sanded a little bit more down, get rid of some of those chips, sand a little bit more of those dents down. Now I'm going to grab some putty. We're going to mix some putty up and put it on. Putty is good for small dents and stuff. You don't want to go over 1/16 of an inch. I think that one's probably going to be over, but I'm going to experiment with it and see what happens. But let's mix the putty up. I got a little gab right down there. And then I'm going to mix up some of the hardener, and let's get to work. And I'm back, and here's the car here. We got it all puttied up and everything else. Some of it I didn't do a very good job on, because once it starts to harden, it doesn't really want to be flexible anymore. And then the more you fuck with it, the more it just makes a mess. So you got to work pretty fast with the putty. And like I said, 1/16 of an inch, and actually once that's sanded down, I'll probably be pretty good for that. But anyways, here it is here. We're going to call it a day for now. Let that putty cure and set up, and then finish sanding it down tomorrow. One other thing too I forgot to mention, since I have it all puttied up. I should have actually filmed it before. Is that when you're sanding down the hood, like Dent especially, and you're working on the paint, you really want to feather it back, because if you just have rough edges where you sanded it down or grinded it down in the paint, you're going to have an edge. So you want to sand it back. So you can see, so here's the metal. This is probably the sealer, primer, and then looks like it's been painted before, because it looks like paint, clear coat, then paint, clear coat again. So alright, to sand the putty off your car, there's numerous ways. You can use a flat block. Flat block is what you should use at all times, like 180 grit to 200, depending on your putty. If it sands well, sometimes even heavier grit, like 100. You can wet sand it. I like to wet sand with either like 240 or 400. Wet sanding works really good. If you already have it in primer, I would wet sand in 400. But on this, I'm going to sand the putty off with my orbital sander. Just because it hasn't been in the primer stage, so I'm just going to rip it off with this, and then any other modifications will be done with wet sand and a block afterwards. So let's get this done. Now I wet sanded the pillars down with 240 grit, and you can see some of the little stone chips that hit the pillar have actually impregnated it pretty good, and the rust is already spread. So I'm gonna have to get some shit on there to stop preventing it from rusting even further. I did that on both sides, but now we have an issue before we can prime it, because the edges are still smooth. So I'm going to show you what I do for that. So anytime you have a smooth edge before you prime it, Scotch-Brite pad works really good. As you can see, I can get in there, buff it out, same with the edges here. That way, by doing this, the paint will stick to it and I won't have to worry about it peeling off. So after I hit it with an orbital sander, I went over it with a flat block with 180 grit. And you can see right here, this was actually the largest amount of putty left on the hood. Everything pretty much sanded out. I thought this one here was going to be the biggest, but once I sanded it down to the metal, flat. Same with all these, everything's all flat. And I went through with the Scotch-Brite, did it on the edges. So I'm going to end this video at this, and there'll be another video on priming and wet sanding.